Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're digging into a specific source today, the SRRK Q1 2025 earnings call transcript.
Right. Our goal is to really unpack what they discussed,
Right.
figure out the key results, the updates, their priorities, and basically pull out what's most important for you to know from that call.
Exactly. Earnings calls can be, well, dense.
Definitely dense. Lots of detail. We'll try to cut through the noise.
Okay, so let's start high level. SRRK Q1 2025 results and their business update. What's the big picture they kicked off with? Maybe the financials first.
Yeah, financials. They ended the quarter with $364.4 million in cash and equivalents. Pretty solid.
Okay.
And they also pointed out they have access to another $100 million from a debt facility they can draw down this year.
So combined, what does that mean for them?
Well, this gives them an anticipated cash runway stretching into 2027. So enough funding, they believe, for their near-term plans.
And those plans, what are the absolute top priorities they hammered home for this year?
Number one, absolutely number one, is driving the U.S. regulatory approval and then the commercial launch for Apitogramab in SMA, Spinal Muscular Atrophy.
Okay, SMA. And the timeline for that.
They're targeting Q3 2025 for that U.S. launch, and then following that up in other places, Europe, Asia Pacific, Latin America.
Got it. SMA launch is the big near-term focus. What else is critical on their list for 2025?
Well, closely related is getting that European approval moving forward. They anticipate a 2026 launch there, starting with Germany.
Makes sense. Anything else with Apitegromab?
Yes, they also plan to start a study in infants and toddlers with SMA, specifically those under age 2. That's also slated for Q3 this year.
Okay. And beyond Apitegromab, any other pipeline moves?
2 key things there. Filing an IND application for a different molecule, SRK 409, that's a subcutaneous anti-myostatin antibody. That's planned for Q3, and also finalizing their clinical development plans for Apitogramab in other neuromuscular conditions. Plus, we expect top-line results from the EMBRACE study in June.
Wow, okay. That's definitely a full plate. But Apitegromab and SMA seems like the main event right now. Let's really dig into that. The phase 3 SAPPHIRE trial data was obviously key. What did they highlight from that?
Yeah, foundational is the right word. They reported that the trial showed a statistically significant and clinically meaningful improvement in motor function. The main measure was the Hammersmith scale.
And what was the key finding there?
The impact. They emphasized that patients on Apitogramab had about a 3-fold higher chance of getting a 3-point or greater increase on that Hammersmith scale compared to the placebo group.
And the placebo group.
The placebo group actually worsened, which is typical in SMA progression. So they're framing this as potentially reversing that trajectory from loss of function to gain.
That sounds, well, pretty significant. Was this seen across the board, different patient types?
Yes, they made a point of saying the data was consistent across different subgroups they looked at beforehand. Things like what type of background SMN therapy patients were on, their age, when they started that SMN therapy, even geography.
Okay, so broad consistency.
Exactly. And they mentioned other outcome measures, like the revised upper limb module and the WHO Motor Development Index, also supported the main finding. And importantly, a very encouraging safety profile was reported.
All right, strong data package, it sounds like. So regulatory path, how's that looking?
That's the other big piece of news. The BLA, the application in the U.S., was granted priority review by the FDA.
Priority review, that signals something specific, right?
It does. By the FDA's own definition, it suggests the therapy could address an unmet need or offer a significant improvement over what's already available. The PDUFA date, the FDA's target decision date, is September 22nd.
September 22nd, okay. In Europe?
In Europe, the MAA, their application, was validated by the EMA. They described talks with both the FDA and EMA as constructive and on track for that PDUFA date. No specific issues flagged during the review, according to them.
Okay, regulatory seems positive, on track. Let's shift to actually getting this to patients, assuming approval. Commercialization, how are they positioning Apitogramab?
This is where they really differentiate. They do describe SMA as having 2 components. The motor neuron degeneration, which current drugs target, but also significant muscle atrophy. Apitogramab, they position as potentially the first therapy to directly target that muscle side of the disease. It works by inhibiting myostatin.
Myostatin, that's the protein that limits muscle growth, right?
Exactly. It's like a brake on muscle building.
Yeah.
Apitogramab aims to release that brake, promoting muscle health. They argue that even with current treatments, most SMA patients still lose muscle over time. That's the unmet need they're targeting.
And is there evidence patients want that?
They cited some external data. A Cure SMA survey, for instance, showed 90% of patients identified improving muscle strength as important. And they said 80% of treating neurologists agree you should try to preserve muscle as early as you can.
Makes sense. What about the market size? How many patients are we talking about, and is their team ready?
In the U.S., they estimate about 10,000 patients with SMA. Maybe 2/3 of those have received one of the existing SMN therapies. Globally, the number's around 35,000 who've received an SMN drug.
And the team?
They're building it out. Hiring is underway. They expect to be fully staffed, around 50 people, by mid-2025, so ahead of that potential Q3 launch. They also mentioned neurologists seem to recognize the potential need for a dual approach hitting both motor neurons and muscle.
Okay. And what about payers? Getting it covered?
They described those discussions in the U.S. as positive so far. They pointed out that payers already cover multiple, often expensive SMN therapies. And because SMA is rare, the budget impact of adding another one is likely manageable for individual payers.
Yeah.
That was the argument.
So preparation seems well underway. Supply ready.
They stated they're preparing to launch potentially the day after the PDUFA date, and that they have ample supply ready to go.
But what about the actual launch itself? Smooth sailing, or are there hurdles?
Bit of both, it sounds like. On the plus side, things like 100% newborn screening in the U.S. helps find patients early. And treatment is concentrated in specialized centers, which makes outreach potentially easier.
Okay, those are tailwinds. Headwinds.
Definitely headwinds too. Getting on insurance formularies takes time, that process. And a big one is getting a J-code. That's the billing code needed for physician-administered drugs like this.
Ah, the J-code issue. How long does that take?
It can take 6 months, sometimes longer. So because of those factors, the formulary reviews, the J-code delay, they're setting expectations for a, quote, consistent and steady launch, not, an immediate blockbuster sales curve right away.
Got it. Manage expectations. What about price? Any hints?
Not specific numbers. They just said pricing would reflect the rarity, the severity of SMA, and the value they believe Apitogramab provides. They reiterated it shouldn't break the bank for any single payer. They did briefly mention the executive order on MFN pricing, basically saying it's early, but they feel well positioned regardless, but no specific launch guidance metrics for now.
Okay, that really clarifies the SMA picture. Huge focus there. But you mentioned other plans. What's the thinking beyond SMA, leveraging this Myostatin platform?
Yeah, and this is where it gets potentially really expansive. They expressed a lot of excitement about applying the same approach targeting myostatin to other rare, severe neuromuscular diseases.
Like what?
They specifically mentioned encouraging preclinical data in models of Duchenne Muscular Dystrophy, DMD, and also FSHD, another muscular dystrophy, so that supports looking at Apitogramab in those conditions. They also floated ALS as another area they're thinking about.
So potentially moving into other muscle diseases. When do we hear more?
They're working on the clinical plans now and said they'll share more details later in the year.
Okay. And what about that other drug candidate, SRK 439?
Right, SRK 439, that's the subcutaneous anti-myostatin antibody. They confirmed they're still on track to file the IND application for that in Q3 this year, regardless of other data readouts.
And the strategy there?
They described it as providing optionality for the pipeline. It could potentially boost their efforts in neuromuscular diseases or could potentially pivot towards cardiometabolic diseases. Depends on future data.
Cardiometabolic. Okay, that leads us to the EMBRACE study. Completely different area, obesity. What's the goal there?
Yeah, it's definitely exploratory. They're trying to see if their anti-myostatin approach could help with a specific problem in obesity treatment. The muscle loss that often happens with weight loss drugs like GLP-1s.
Right, you lose fat but also muscle.
Exactly. They noted that typically maybe a quarter to a third of the weight lost on GLP-1s can be lean mass, muscle. So the EMBRACE study, a phase 2 trial, is looking at whether their approach can help reduce that muscle loss in obese patients taking these therapies.
And we get results soon.
Top-line results are expected in June 2025, very soon.
What are they expecting to see maybe in the control group?
They said based on historical data with GLP-1s alone, they'd expect that control group, the ones not getting their drug, to show roughly that 25-30% muscle loss proportion by week 24.
Any limitations to keep in mind with this study?
They did acknowledge one. The follow-up period after stopping treatment is only 8 weeks. So it won't fully answer the question about long-term weight regain and muscle preservation trajectory. But they expect it to provide really important initial insights.
So, wow, we've got this core focus on a rare muscle disease, SMA, potentially moving into others like DMD, and then this exploratory but potentially huge foray into the obesity market side effect space. How does management tie this all together strategically for investors?
Their narrative is pretty clear. The SMA opportunity, if successful, is positioned as the engine. It's expected to provide, quote, many years of sustainable growth.
And that growth funds.
It funds thoughtful investment back into the pipeline, advancing Apitogramab into those other neuromuscular diseases, developing SRRK 439, and continuing that exploratory work. Pipeline investment is linked to commercial success, is the message.
And they feel the finances support this dual approach, launch and development.
They reiterated that their financial position, the cash on hand, the debt facility, runway into 2027, supports both the commercial launch and these ongoing programs.
Any other strategic points they made? Partnerships.
Yeah, interestingly, they stated pretty explicitly they are not looking for a commercial partner outside the U.S. for Apitogramab right now. They cited their team's deep experience in global rare disease launches, essentially saying, we know how to do this ourselves.
Okay, confidence in their internal capabilities. How do they see Apitogramab fitting into the existing SMA market? It's already got players.
Right. It's about a $5 billion annual market currently across 3 existing therapies. They position Apitogramab as potentially helping all patients, regardless of which SMN therapy they were on before, or even if they got gene therapy like Zolgensma. They mentioned the upcoming OPAL study in infants will give them more experience specifically in younger, potentially treatment-naive or Zolgensma-treated patients.
So bottom line, what's the big picture story they're telling?
It's really about evolution, scaling SRRK into a global biopharmaceutical company. The SMA launch is the crucial first step, the catalyst, the financial driver. But underpinning that is the broader potential of their Myostatin platform, fueling pipeline growth into other significant diseases. Near-term execution, driving long-term platform value.
Okay. Now let's shift gears slightly for our This Is Not Financial Advice segment. Just to be absolutely clear, everything we've discussed up to now is based only on information presented in the SRRK Q1 2025 earnings call transcript, summarized for your understanding. What follows now is purely a hypothetical thought exercise.
Completely hypothetical, not advice.
Right. So putting on our imaginary hedge fund analyst hats for a moment, based only on the call details, here's an outrageous but plausible trade idea. SRRK has 2 potentially massive catalysts coming up relatively close together. June 2025 for the Embrace obesity data, and September 22nd for the SMA PDUFA.
2 big binary events, potentially.
Exactly. Now, based on the call, SMA approval seems, let's say, reasonably likely. Priority review, positive commentary on regulatory talks, but the Embrace readout in obesity, that's exploratory phase 2. Huge potential if it shows a strong signal on preserving muscle, but maybe lower odds of being definitively practice-changing from this initial data alone.
Higher uncertainty there for sure.
So the outrageous but plausible trade isn't just betting on the SMA approval with standard calls. No, we structure something different, maybe highly leveraged, long-dated, out-of-the-money call spreads. And the key is the expiration date. After the September PDUFA and well after that June Embrace data settles. Think maybe December 2025 or even January 2026 calls.
So looking beyond the immediate reactions.
Precisely. The bet here is on a specific scenario. That positive signals from Embrace, even if they're just preliminary or hypothesis generating, combined with the expected SMA approval, leads to a massive sustained re-rating of the stock. A re-rating that goes way beyond what SMA approval alone might trigger.
Interesting. So the bet is on the synergy of the news, validating the whole platform idea across different markets.
You got it. It's betting the market sees the compound effect. Validation in rare disease and a strong signal of potential in a massive metabolic market, confirming the power of their Myostatin platform. It's designed to look past any short-term volatility around the June data interpretation and capture a bigger, longer-term re-rating if both pieces land favorably. Aggressive. Yes. Assumes positive perception correlation. Yes. Leverages binary outcomes for asymmetric upside. Absolutely. Pure alpha if both are perceived well.
What's fascinating in that hypothetical is how it explicitly links the market's reaction to 2 very different programs. It really highlights the question of how much the market might price in potential from an exploratory early-stage readout in a huge market like obesity, especially when paired with a more concrete rare disease approval.
Exactly. That linkage and the market's interpretation is the core of that hypothetical bet.
Yeah.
And one last time, purely a hypothetical scenario based only on the transcript details. Absolutely not investment advice.
Definitely not advice, just an exercise based on the call contents.
Okay, so let's wrap up this deep dive into the SRRK Q1 call. Key takeaways. strong progress on Apitogramab for SMA, the compelling phase 3 data, that priority review status setting up the September PDUFA, and detailed prep for a potential Q3 launch.
Right. And then there's the intriguing pipeline potential, using that Myostatin platform for other neuromuscular diseases like DMD, FSHD, maybe ALS. Plus that exploratory but high potential work in obesity with the EMBRACE study reading out soon.
And all underpinned, they say, by a solid financial position giving them runway into 2027.
Our goal here was simply to distill the essence of that earnings call transcript, giving you a clear view of what the company reported and prioritized, straight from that source material. And as always, this is for informational purposes only.
Absolutely, not financial advice. So here's a final thought to leave you with based on everything we unpacked. Scholar Rock is trying to build from a rare disease base, SMA, into potentially much larger, but maybe more uncertain markets like other muscular conditions and even obesity. How might a company effectively balance the focus and resources needed for near-term execution in that rare disease launch, while also nurturing the long-term, perhaps riskier potential in these broader areas? What does that balancing act say about platform companies today?
That's a great question. Managing that portfolio, balancing risk and reward across different timelines and market sizes is definitely a core challenge.
Something to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.